My father wasn't there when I woke up from heart surgery at 14 years old. I want you to sit with that for a moment before I say anything else. I was 14. I had just had my chest opened. I had just had a team of surgeons cut through my sternum and repair a valve in my heart that had been slowly failing since I was born. And when I opened my eyes in the recovery room, groggy and confused and terrified and in more pain than I had ever experienced in my short life, the first thing I saw was a white ceiling with fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly, and the second thing I saw was an empty chair beside my bed, and the third thing I saw was a nurse, whose name I would later learn was Denise. And Denise was holding my hand because no one else was there to hold it. No one. Not my mother. Not my father. Not my brother. The chair was empty. The room was empty. The hallway outside was empty of anyone who belonged to me. And when I turned my head, which took an enormous amount of effort because my entire body felt like it had been filled with wet concrete, and I looked at Denise with what must have been the most confused and frightened expression a 14-year-old girl can make, she squeezed my hand and said very gently, "You did so well, sweetheart. The surgery went perfectly. You're going to be just fine." And I opened my mouth, and the first words I said after having my heart surgically repaired were, "Where is my dad?" Denise's face did something that I have never forgotten. It shifted. It moved through several emotions very quickly, compassion and then something harder, something that looked like controlled anger, and then back to compassion. And she said, "Your family has been contacted. Someone will be here soon." Someone will be here soon. That sentence lived inside me for 20 years. It lived inside me while I recovered in that hospital room with Denise checking on me every 45 minutes. It lived inside me when my mother finally arrived 6 hours after I woke up, smelling like the cold outside air and carrying a gas station coffee and looking flustered in the way she always looked flustered, which was the look of a woman who had been managing everyone else's chaos for so long that she had forgotten she was allowed to have priorities of her own. It lived inside me when I asked her where Dad was, and she looked at the floor and said, "He's with your brother. Tyler had his championship game today. You know how important it was." I knew how important it was. I knew because for the 3 weeks leading up to my surgery, my father had talked about Tyler's championship football game approximately 400 times more than he had talked about the fact that his daughter was about to have open heart surgery. I knew because the night before my surgery, while I sat on my bed in my room trying not to cry because I was terrified of being put under anesthesia and terrified that something would go wrong, and terrified in the specific way that children are terrified when they understand just enough about death to know it is real, but not enough to know how to process that understanding. My father had been in the garage organizing Tyler's football gear and talking on the phone with Tyler's coach about game strategy. I knew because the morning of my surgery, at 5:30 in the morning when my mother was helping me into the car to drive to the hospital, my father had stood in the hallway in his sweatpants and said, "You're going to do great, Rosie. You're tough. I'll be there after Tyler's game, okay?" And my mother had looked at him with an expression I didn't fully understand at the time, but that I now recognize as the expression of a woman who wanted to say something, but had been trained over many years to say nothing. And she had said, "Richard, the surgery is scheduled for 7. She'll be in recovery by noon at the latest." And my father had said, "And Tyler's game starts at 1. I'll come straight to the hospital after." And that was it. That was the calculation. That was the math my father did in his head and found acceptable. His daughter's heart surgery started at 7 in the morning. His son's football game started at 1 in the afternoon. And rather than being at the hospital from 7 in the morning onward, rather than sitting in a waiting room for 5 hours while his daughter was unconscious on an operating table with her chest open, he chose to stay home, sleep in, and go to a football game. I need you to understand something about the kind of pain I am describing. It is not the kind of pain that announces itself loudly. It is not the kind of pain that makes you scream or throw things or confront people in dramatic hallways. It is the kind of pain that sits down quietly inside your chest, right next to the heart they just finished repairing, and it stays there. It doesn't leave. It just becomes part of the architecture. It becomes part of the way you understand yourself in relation to the world, which is to say that you understand yourself as someone who can be deprioritized, someone whose crisis is less urgent than someone else's game, someone whose open chest is less compelling than someone else's touchdown. If you have ever felt like the least important person in your own family, then you already understand what I'm telling you. If you've ever sat in a room and realized that the people who were supposed to show up for you simply didn't, not because they couldn't, not because something prevented them, but because something else mattered more, then you know exactly what that empty chair felt like. And if you're still here, stay with me. Because this story doesn't end in that recovery room. It barely begins there. My name is Rosie Brennan. I am 34 years old. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, with my husband James and my 2 children, Lily, who is 8, and Noah, who is 5. I am the chief financial officer of a healthcare technology company called MedBridge Solutions that I co-founded 6 years ago. I have a scar down the center of my chest that has faded over 20 years, but that I can still feel when I press my fingers against it. And I have a story that I have been carrying for a very long time that I am finally going to tell in full, from the very beginning to the very end, because I think there are people who need to hear it. Let me take you back further. Let me take you back to before the surgery, before the empty chair, before the calculation my father made in the hallway at 5:30 in the morning. Let me take you to the beginning. I grew up in a small town in central Pennsylvania called Marden. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and where Friday night football games were treated with a reverence that in larger places is reserved for religious services or natural disasters. My father, Richard Brennan, was a high school football coach before he became a warehouse supervisor, and even after he stopped coaching officially, he never stopped coaching in his heart. Football was not a sport to my father. It was a language. It was the way he expressed love and attention and approval and pride. It was the lens through which he saw the entire world. And unfortunately for me, I was born into a body that could not play football and a heart that literally could not sustain the effort. My brother Tyler was 2 years older than me. He was big and fast and aggressive in the way that football demands, and from the time he was old enough to hold a ball, my father looked at him like he was looking at his own reflection, perfected and polished and given a second chance. Tyler played football from age 6 onward. He played in every youth league, every school team, every summer camp, every weekend clinic. My father drove him to every practice, attended every game, recorded every play on a camcorder that he treated with more care than he treated most human beings. The living room of our house had a wall that my mother called Tyler's wall, though she always said it with a small laugh like it was a joke, even though it wasn't a joke at all. Tyler's wall had his team photos from every year, his trophies arranged by season, newspaper clippings from the local paper whenever his name was mentioned, and a framed copy of a letter from a college scout who had attended one of his junior year games and expressed interest. That letter was treated like a religious artifact in our house. My father referenced it at least once a week. "Tyler's got a real shot," he would say at dinner, at family gatherings, at the hardware store to men he barely knew. "Real talent. College-level talent. Could go all the way." And where was I in all of this? I was the quiet girl sitting at the end of the table. I was the one with the heart condition. I was the one who had been diagnosed at age 4 with a congenital bicuspid aortic valve, which meant that one of the valves in my heart had 2 flaps instead of 3, which meant that my heart had to work harder than a normal heart to pump blood, which meant that I got tired more easily than other children, which meant that I couldn't run as fast or play as hard or do any of the things that my father valued in a child. I want to be very careful here because I am not saying my father was a monster. I want to be honest about that because the truth is more complicated than monstrousness and more painful. My father was a man who had one language of love, and that language was physical achievement, competition, toughness, strength. He loved Tyler because Tyler spoke that language fluently. He didn't know what to do with me because I existed in a language he had never learned to read. When I was small, he tried. I remember him tossing a softball with me in the backyard when I was 5 or 6, and I remember the way his face changed when I got winded after 10 minutes and had to sit down in the grass, and I remember that we didn't play catch again after that. I remember him coming to one of my school spelling bees when I was 8, and I won. And afterward in the car, he said, "Good job, Rosie." And then he turned on the radio to listen to a college football recap, and we drove home in the sound of someone else's game. I remember the year I got the highest grade in my class on a science project about the human cardiovascular system, which I had chosen specifically because I wanted to understand my own heart. And I brought the project home with a ribbon on it, and my father glanced at it and said, "That's nice, honey," and then asked Tyler about his practice. These are small moments. Individually, they are almost nothing, but they accumulated the way snow accumulates, silently, constantly, until one morning you look outside and the entire landscape has changed and everything is buried. My mother's name was Diane. She was a dental hygienist who worked 4 days a week and spent the rest of her time managing the household and driving Tyler to practices and managing my medical appointments and existing in the exhausted center of a family that revolved around her husband's obsession and her son's talent and her daughter's condition. I loved my mother. I want to say that clearly. She was not the villain of this story in the way my father was. She was something more complicated and in some ways more painful, which was a woman who saw what was happening, who understood at some level that her daughter was being sidelined, who felt the wrongness of it in her body, but who lacked the ability or the willingness or the energy to challenge the structure that her husband had built. She compensated in small ways. She came to my school events. She helped me with homework. She sat with me during my cardiology appointments and held my hand when the doctors explained things that scared me. She was present in the ways that didn't require her to confront my father, and she was absent in the ways that did. I learned from my mother that love without advocacy is a specific kind of loneliness. You are loved, technically. Someone cares about you, technically. But when the moment comes that requires that person to stand up and say, "This is wrong," and they don't, the love starts to feel like a decoration on a wall, something that looks nice but doesn't actually hold anything up. Now, I need to tell you about the year leading up to my surgery because this is where everything began to accelerate toward that empty chair. When I was 13, my cardiologist, Dr. Amara Singh, told my parents that my valve was deteriorating faster than expected and that I would need surgical repair within the next 12 to 18 months. This was not unexpected. We had known since I was 4 that surgery would eventually be necessary, but eventually is a word that allows people to avoid thinking about things, and when Dr. Singh put a specific timeline on it, the reality of it entered our house like a new piece of furniture that everyone had to rearrange their lives around. My mother rearranged immediately. She began researching surgical teams, calling hospitals, reading everything she could find about pediatric cardiac valve repair. She started a binder. I remember the binder. It was blue. It had tabs for different sections: surgical options, recovery timelines, insurance documents, post-operative care. My mother put her fear into organization, which was how she coped with everything. My father's response was different. He acknowledged the information. He said the right things. He said, "We'll get through this as a family." He said, "Rosie's tough." He said, "The doctors know what they're doing." And then he continued his life exactly as it had been before, which was a life centered on Tyler's football career, which was entering its most critical phase because Tyler was now a junior in high school and the college scouts were beginning to pay serious attention. I want you to understand the timeline here because it matters. My surgery was scheduled for a Saturday morning in November. Tyler's championship game, the biggest game of his high school career, was scheduled for the same Saturday afternoon. My parents knew about both dates months in advance. There was no surprise. There was no sudden conflict. This was a collision that everyone could see coming from miles away, and the question of how my father would handle it hung over our house like a weather system that no one wanted to name. I thought about it constantly. I lay in bed at night and I thought about it with the obsessive circular thinking of a child who needs reassurance but is afraid to ask for it, because asking for it means admitting that the answer might be the wrong one. I played conversations in my head. I imagined my father sitting in the hospital waiting room during my surgery, checking his phone for game updates maybe, but being there, being physically present in the building where his daughter's chest was being opened. I imagined him holding my hand when I woke up. I imagined him saying, "I'm right here, Rosie. I'm not going anywhere." I told myself these things so many times that they started to feel like memories rather than fantasies, which is a dangerous trick that the mind plays on children who need their parents to be better than they actually are. About 3 weeks before the surgery, Tyler's coach called our house. I was sitting in the living room doing homework, and I heard my father answer the phone in the kitchen, and I heard the tone of his voice change the way it always changed when football was being discussed, warmer and more animated and more alive. I heard him say, "Championship game, Saturday the 14th. Absolutely. He'll be ready. We'll all be there." My hand stopped moving on my notebook. Saturday the 14th. That was my surgery date. My father hung up the phone and walked into the living room, and he was smiling in the broad, uncomplicated way he smiled when something about Tyler's career was going well. And he looked at me sitting on the couch, and his smile didn't exactly falter, but it adjusted, the way a camera adjusts focus, and I could see in his face the moment the two dates collided in his mind. He said, "Rosie, Tyler's championship game got confirmed, same day as your surgery." I said, "I know." He sat down in his recliner. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The surgery is in the morning. The game is in the afternoon. It should work out fine. I'll come to the hospital after the game." I stared at him. I was 13 years old, and I stared at my father, and I waited for the rest of the sentence. I waited for the "just kidding." I waited for the "of course I'll be at the hospital the whole time." I waited for any indication that what he had just said was not what he actually meant. He looked at me, looking at him, and he said, "What?" I said, "The surgery takes 5 hours, Dad. I'll be in recovery by the time you get there." He said, "And I'll be there when you wake up. It's fine, Rosie. Tyler needs me at that game. This is his future." I opened my mouth. I closed it. I opened it again. I said, "My chest is going to be open." He said, "And the doctors will take care of that. That's their job. But Tyler's game, this is a once-in-a-lifetime thing. Scouts will be there. I need to be there." I looked at my father, and I understood something in that moment that I had been circling around for years without letting myself land on. I understood that in the math of his love, I did not add up to enough. Tyler's football game was worth more than my open chest. Tyler's potential scholarship was worth more than my fear. Tyler's future was worth more than my present. And I was not going to argue about it because I had spent my entire life watching this math being done, and I had never once seen the answer come out in my favor, and I was tired. I was so deeply, specifically, exhaustingly tired of being the thing that didn't add up. I said, "Okay." He nodded, relieved, the way people are relieved when someone stops asking them to be better than they want to be. I went back to my homework. My heart, the broken one that was about to be surgically repaired, did something painful in my chest that had nothing to do with the valve. That night, my mother came into my room. She sat on the edge of my bed. She said, "I talked to your father." I looked at her. She said, "I'll be at the hospital, the whole time. I'll be right there when you wake up." I said, "But Dad won't be." She looked at her hands. She said, "Your father loves you, Rosie. He just doesn't always show it the way he should." I said nothing because there was nothing to say to that sentence that wouldn't have broken something between my mother and me that I needed to keep intact because she was the only parent I had who was going to be in the building while my heart was being repaired. If you are enjoying this story, tell me where you are listening from. Drop a comment right now. I want to know who is here with me as I tell this because this next part is the hardest part, and I need to know I'm not telling it into empty air. The morning of the surgery arrived, and it was cold and dark, and Had not slept well because you don't sleep well when you are 14 years old, and you know that in a few hours someone is going to put you to sleep in a different way and cut your chest open and touch your heart with instruments. My mother woke me at 5 in the morning. She had made me a cup of tea even though I couldn't drink it because I had been fasting since midnight, but she put it on my nightstand anyway because the gesture was the point. She helped me get dressed. She carried my bag. She walked with me to the car. And in the hallway, as we passed the kitchen, my father was standing there in his sweatpants and his old coaching jacket, the one with Brennan stitched on the chest, and he was holding a cup of coffee and he looked at me and he said the words I told you about earlier. "You're going to do great, Rosie. You're tough. I'll be there after Tyler's game, okay?" I looked at him. I said, "Okay, Dad." And we left. My mother drove me to the hospital in silence. Not angry silence, sad silence. The silence of a woman who was carrying something too heavy to put into words. At the hospital, everything moved quickly. I was admitted. I was prepped. I was given a gown. I met the anesthesiologist, a kind woman named Dr. Patel who explained everything she was going to do in a calm and steady voice, and who asked me if I had any questions, and I said, "Will I dream?" And she smiled and said, "Most people don't, but if you do, I hope it's a good one." My mother was there. She held my hand. She kissed my forehead. She said, "I'll be right here when you wake up, Rosie. Right here." And then they took me in, and Dr. Patel asked me to count backward from 10, and I got to 7, and the world went away. I don't know what happened during the 5 hours I was unconscious. I know from the surgical report that the procedure went well, that Dr. Amara Singh and her team repaired the valve successfully, that there were no complications, that my heart, my physical heart, the one made of muscle and blood and faulty engineering, was fixed. I know from what I was told later that my mother sat in the waiting room for the full 5 hours. I know that she called my father twice during the surgery and that he answered once and said he was getting Tyler ready for the game and that he would be there as soon as it was over. I know that she called my grandmother, her mother, and that my grandmother offered to come but lived 4 hours away and wouldn't have made it in time. I know that my mother sat alone in that waiting room for 5 hours, and I know that she cried at least once because a nurse mentioned it to me later, gently, the way nurses mention things when they want you to know that someone cared. And then the surgery was over and I was moved to recovery, and this is where something happened that changed everything. My mother was supposed to be there when I woke up. She had promised. She had said, "Right here." But when I woke up, she wasn't there either. Denise was there, the nurse, the stranger, the woman whose job it was to monitor my vital signs and who had no obligation to hold my hand, but who held it anyway because the chair beside my bed was empty, and she could see in my face the particular devastation of a child who has woken up from surgery alone. Where was my mother? I found out later. While I was in surgery, my mother had received a call from Tyler's school. Tyler had been in an altercation with another player during warm-ups before the game. He had shoved someone. There had been a confrontation. The coach was involved. My father was there, but the school wanted both parents present to discuss whether Tyler would be allowed to play. My mother had left the hospital 30 minutes before I came out of surgery. She had left to go handle Tyler's situation at a football game. She had left her daughter in post-operative cardiac recovery to go make sure her son could play a game. I want to be fair to my mother here because I have spent 20 years thinking about this, and I believe, genuinely, that she thought she would be back in time. I believe she thought she could drive to the school, handle the situation, and drive back before I woke up. I believe she made a calculation that was wrong, not malicious, just wrong, the kind of wrong that happens when you have spent your entire life putting out everyone else's fires and you lose the ability to know which fire is the most important. But she was wrong. She was not there. Neither of them was there. I woke up alone. Denise held my hand for 45 minutes before my mother arrived, rushing through the door of the recovery room with her coat still on and her car keys still in her hand and her face red from crying and from the cold. And she saw me looking at her from the bed, and she stopped in the doorway, and the expression on her face was the expression of a woman who knew she had just failed the most important test of her life. She came to my bed. She took my hand from Denise. She said, "I'm here. I'm so sorry, Rosie. I'm here now." I looked at her and I said nothing, not because I was punishing her with silence, because I had nothing left. The surgery had taken everything from my body, and the empty chair had taken everything from my spirit, and I was 14 years old, and I was lying in a hospital bed with a repaired heart and a broken everything else, and I simply had no words available to me. My father arrived 4 hours later. 4 hours. Tyler's game had been played. Tyler had been allowed to play after the altercation was resolved. They had won the championship. My father walked into my hospital room with Tyler beside him, both of them still in their game day clothes, Tyler's hair sweaty, my father's coaching jacket zipped up, and my father was carrying a small bouquet of flowers from the gas station near the highway, and he set them on the table beside my bed, and he said, "Hey, kiddo. How are you feeling? Tyler won the championship. Can you believe it?" I looked at the flowers. I looked at my father. I looked at Tyler, who at least had the decency to look uncomfortable, who at least had something in his face that suggested he understood that this moment was wrong, even if he didn't fully understand why. I said, "Congratulations." My father smiled. He actually smiled. He pulled up the empty chair, the chair that had been empty for hours, the chair that Denise had sat in, and he sat down and he started telling me about the game, about Tyler's performance, about the scouts who had been watching, about the winning play. He told me about a football game while I lay in a hospital bed with surgical staples in my chest. My mother stood by the window and said nothing. She looked at me once, and I saw in her eyes something that I can only describe as a plea. A silent, desperate plea for me not to say anything, not to confront him, not to create a scene. And I understood in that moment that my mother had been making that plea her entire marriage, had been asking the world to just let things go, to not make things harder, to accept what was offered and not demand what was owed. I didn't say anything. I lay in my bed and I listened to my father talk about football, and I looked at the fluorescent lights on the ceiling that had buzzed faintly when I woke up alone, and I made a decision that I did not fully understand at the time, but that would shape the rest of my life. I decided that I would never again wait for someone to show up for me. I would show up for myself. Recovery took 6 weeks. I spent 4 days in the hospital, and then I went home and I lay in my bed in my room, and my mother brought me food and my medication and helped me with the surgical site. And I healed, physically, the way 14-year-olds heal, which is quickly and almost defiantly, the body insisting on its own repair despite everything. During those 6 weeks, my father came into my room exactly 3 times that I remember. Once to tell me that Tyler had received a formal letter of interest from a Division II college. Once to ask me if I had seen the remote control for the television. Once to stand in the doorway and look at me for a moment in a way that might have been guilt or might have been confusion or might have been nothing at all, and then to say, "You need anything?" And when I said no, to nod and walk away. I went back to school in January. I had missed 6 weeks of classes, and I spent the rest of the school year catching up, which I did because I had always been good at school and because school was the one place where effort was measured fairly, where what you put in was directly connected to what you got out, where no one's football game could override your achievement. I got straight A's that year. My father did not comment on them. The years after the surgery are the years I think of as the quiet years, the years when I was physically present in my family's house but emotionally somewhere else entirely, somewhere private and interior and under construction. I went to school, I studied, I joined the debate team because it was the furthest thing from football I could find. I got a part-time job at a bookstore when I was 16. I saved money with the quiet discipline of someone who understood that money was freedom, and freedom was the distance between yourself and the people who had shown you exactly how much you mattered to them. I want to tell you about a specific moment during those quiet years because it crystallized something important. I was 16 years old, and it was a Friday evening in autumn, and my father and Tyler were getting ready to leave for Tyler's college game. Tyler had received a football scholarship, Division II, not the full ride my father had dreamed of, but enough to vindicate every hour my father had spent in. Service to Tyler's athletic career. My father was in the kitchen packing a cooler. Tyler was in the driveway loading the car. My mother was wiping down the kitchen counter. I was sitting at the kitchen table doing calculus homework. My father looked at me and said, "You sure you don't want to come to Tyler's game?" I said, "I have homework." He said, "You always have homework. Come watch your brother play." I looked at him. I said, "I have a debate tournament tomorrow morning." He said, "A debate tournament?" He said it the way you say something when you are repeating it to demonstrate how insignificant it sounds compared to the thing you actually care about. I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I guess we'll see you when we get back then." And he left. And I sat at the kitchen table and I did my calculus homework, and the house was quiet and I was alone in it in the way I had been alone in it for a long time, even when other people were present. I won my debate tournament the next morning. I drove myself. I competed. I won. I drove home with the trophy in the passenger seat, and I put it on my desk in my room, and no one in my family asked about it until 3 days later when my mother noticed it while putting laundry on my bed and said, "Oh, you won. That's wonderful, Rosie." I graduated high school with honors, 4th in my class, with a scholarship to the University of Virginia that I had applied for, earned, and accepted entirely on my own. I did not ask my parents for help with applications. I did not ask them to review my essays. I did not ask them for anything because I had learned that asking was an invitation to be disappointed, and I had a heart that had already been repaired once and could not afford another break. The day I left for college, my father helped carry my bags to the car. He stood on the driveway and he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, "Make us proud, Rosie." And I looked at his hand on my shoulder, and I thought about all the times that hand had been somewhere else, on Tyler's shoulder pads, on a football, on a steering wheel driving to a game, on a camcorder recording plays, anywhere but where I needed it to be, and I said, "I will." And I got in the car and my mother drove me to Virginia, and I did not look back at the house because there was nothing behind me that I needed to see. College was the first time in my life I felt like I could breathe. Not just metaphorically, though that too, but almost physically. The distance between Virginia and Pennsylvania was 5 hours by car, and it was the exact right amount of space for me to begin understanding who I was without the constant background noise of my own invisibility. I studied finance and healthcare administration, a double major that nearly killed me with its workload, but that I chose because I had spent enough of my life inside the healthcare system to understand its mechanics, and because I wanted to work in a field where I could make the experience better for other people, especially children who were scared and alone and needed someone to show up for them. I worked 2 jobs. I tutored economics students through the Campus Learning Center, and I worked evening shifts at the front desk of a medical office near campus that specialized in pediatric care, and it was there that I first began to see the intersection of healthcare and business, the way that compassionate care required not just good doctors, but good systems, good technology, efficient processes, all of the invisible architecture that allows a hospital to function so that a nurse like Denise can be free to hold a child's hand instead of drowning in paperwork. I thought about Denise often. I never forgot her. She was the first person to show up for me when it mattered, and she was a stranger, and there was something in that fact that I carried with me like a compass, pointing me toward the kind of person I wanted to be and the kind of life I wanted to build. During college, I went home twice a year, Christmas and 1 week in the summer. These visits were brief and surface level, the kind of family time that looks normal from the outside but feels like performing a play where everyone has forgotten the script. My father asked about my grades once. He told me about Tyler's college football career 4 times per visit. My mother asked about my friends and my classes and whether I was eating enough and whether my heart was doing okay. And these questions were genuine, and I answered them genuinely, and we existed in a small, warm pocket of connection that was real but that never expanded beyond the two of us. Tyler and I had a relationship that I would describe as cordial distance. He was not cruel to me. He had never been deliberately cruel. He was simply the sun in our family's solar system, and I was a moon orbiting something he couldn't see because it was always behind him. He called me occasionally in college, brief calls where he told me about his games and asked how I was doing, and the calls lasted 5 minutes and felt like an obligation he was checking off a list. Have you ever dealt with a sibling who got everything while you got nothing? I know so many of you understand exactly what this dynamic feels like. Drop a comment below and tell me about it, because I think one of the most important things we can do is let each other know that we are not alone in these experiences. I graduated from the University of Virginia at 22 years old with honors in both majors and a job offer from a healthcare consulting firm in Washington, D.C. My parents came to graduation, both of them. My father sat in the audience and clapped when my name was called, and afterward he hugged me and said, "We always knew you'd do well, Rosie." And I let him hug me, and I did not point out that he had never once said that before, had never once expressed confidence in my academic future the way he had expressed confidence in Tyler's athletic future, had never once looked at my report card the way he looked at Tyler's game stats. I let him have the hug because it cost me nothing and because I had stopped needing his approval years ago, which was both a freedom and a loss. I moved to D.C. I worked at the consulting firm for 3 years. I was good at it. I was very good at it. I understood healthcare systems in a way that combined analytical precision with genuine empathy, because I had been a patient, because I had been a scared kid in a hospital bed, because I knew what it felt like when the system worked and when it didn't, and what the difference meant to a human being lying in a recovery room wondering where their family was. At 25, I met James. He was a software engineer working on healthcare data systems, and we met at a conference where I was presenting a paper on patient experience metrics, and he was demonstrating a new data platform. He came up to me after my presentation and said, "I agreed with about 80% of what you said, and the 20% I disagreed with, I think you might be able to convince me." I said, "Only 80%? He said, "I'll let you work on the other 20 over coffee." And that was it. That was the beginning of everything good. James is the kind of man who listens like listening is an action verb. He is the kind of man who, when I told him about the surgery and the empty chair and the football game, didn't immediately try to fix it or explain it or minimize it. He sat with it. He let the weight of it exist in the room between us. And then he said, very quietly, "I would have been there. I need you to know that. I would have been there before you went in, and I would have been there when you woke up, and I would not have left." And I cried. Not because I was sad, though I was. Because I was 26 years old, and it was the first time anyone had said those words to me and meant them in a way that I believed completely. We were married when I was 28. His family was warm and present and bewildering to me in ways that Clara would understand if she heard me describe it. His mother, Sandra, called me every Sunday, not because she wanted something, not because there was a crisis, just because she wanted to hear my voice. This confused me deeply for the first year. I kept waiting for the condition, the request, the hidden agenda. It never came. Sandra just loved me because James loved me, and because she was a person whose love did not require you to earn it continuously. When Lily was born, I held her in my arms, and I looked at her tiny face, and I made a promise that was so fierce and so absolute that it felt less like a thought and more like a physical force. I promised her that I would be there, for everything. For every surgery and every scraped knee and every school play and every spelling bee and every nightmare and every moment, large or small, where she needed someone to show up. I would show up. I would always show up. And I have. Not perfectly. I am not a perfect mother. But I have been present, consciously and deliberately and relentlessly present, in a way that is both natural and chosen, because I know what the alternative feels like, and I will never allow my children to wake up in a room and find the chair empty. 3 years after Lily was born, James and I co-founded MedBridge Solutions. It started as an idea we had talked about for years, a technology platform that would improve the patient experience in hospitals and clinics, specifically the communication between medical teams and families. We designed systems that kept families informed during surgeries, that sent real-time updates to waiting rooms, that ensured no parent ever sat for 5 hours without knowing what was happening to their child. I did not name the company after my experience, but the company was born from my experience. Every feature we designed, every system we built, every product we launched was informed by the memory of waking up alone, of the fluorescent lights, of Denise's hand, of the empty chair. By the time I was 32, MedBridge Solutions had contracts with 47 hospitals across 6 states. By 33, we had raised our Series B funding and were expanding nationally. By 34, I was the CFO of a company that was genuinely changing the way hospitals communicated with families during critical medical procedures, and I was doing it from an office in Charlotte, North Carolina, where the walls were painted a warm gray and where there were no trophies on the walls, just a framed photo of Lily and Noah and James on the beach, and a small framed card that Denise the nurse had sent me when she somehow found out about my company years later. A card that said, "I held your hand once. Now you're holding hands for millions. So proud of you, Rosie." I need to tell you now about what had been happening with my family during the years I was building all of this, because the story doesn't exist in a vacuum, and the people who hurt me did not stay frozen in time. They kept moving. They kept making choices, and some of those choices are important for you to understand. Tyler's football career ended in college. He tore his ACL during his junior year, and the injury was severe enough that it ended his athletic career permanently. The scholarship disappeared. The scouts disappeared. The future my father had invested everything in disappeared in a single play on a Saturday afternoon, and I want to be clear that I took no pleasure in this. I have never taken pleasure in Tyler's pain. He did not choose to be the favorite. He did not ask for the weight of our father's obsession. He was a child, too, shaped by the same family, just from a different position. After college, Tyler moved back to Pennsylvania. He worked in construction for a while, then got a job as a physical education teacher at a middle school near our hometown. He married a woman named Stacy. They had 2 children. His life was ordinary and stable and decent, and our relationship remained cordially distant. Occasional texts, a phone call at Christmas, nothing deep but nothing hostile. My father did not handle the end of Tyler's football career well. The thing that had given his life meaning and direction and identity was gone, and without it, he became smaller somehow, quieter, more irritable, more prone to sitting in front of the television in the evening, rewatching old game tapes with a beer in his hand and a look on his face that I would have called grief if I had been generous enough at the time to name it that. My mother continued to manage the household and work at the dental office and exist in the exhausting center of everyone else's needs. She and I talked on the phone every 2 to 3 weeks, conversations that were friendly but careful, conversations that skirted the edges of things without ever touching them directly. She never mentioned the surgery. She never mentioned the empty chair. She never said the words, "I'm sorry for not being there when I woke up," and I never asked her to, because I had decided that I could not make my peace contingent on other people's apologies. About 18 months before the events I'm about to describe, something changed. My mother called me on a Wednesday evening, which was unusual because we usually talked on Sundays. Her voice was different, flatter, more careful. She told me that my father had been diagnosed with a heart condition. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the irony was so sharp it could have drawn blood. My father, the man who had chosen a football game over his daughter's heart surgery, had a heart condition. Specifically, he had been diagnosed with severe coronary artery disease. He needed bypass surgery. The surgery was serious, but the prognosis was good if he followed the treatment plan. My mother told me this in the measured tone of a woman delivering medical information, and then she paused. And in that pause, I heard everything she wasn't saying. She was asking me to come home. She was asking me to be there. She was asking me to show up for the man who had not shown up for me. I told her I needed to think about it. And I did think about it. I thought about it for 3 days. I talked to James about it. I talked to my therapist about it. A woman named Dr. Catherine Osei, who had been helping me process my childhood for 4 years and who was the first person to ever use the word neglect in relation to my upbringing and make me understand that neglect doesn't require malice, that it can be done casually, almost accidentally, by people who are simply looking in the wrong direction. Dr. Osei asked me what I wanted to do, not what I should do, not what a good daughter would do, what I wanted. I said, I want to be different from him. She said, what does that look like? I said, it looks like showing up, even when it's hard, even when the person doesn't deserve it, because showing up isn't about them, it's about me. It's about who I am. And so I went home. I flew to Pennsylvania on a Thursday. I drove to the hospital where my father was being prepped for surgery, a different hospital than the one where I had my surgery 20 years earlier. But hospitals all smell the same, that specific combination of antiseptic and anxiety that lives in the air of every medical facility in the world. I walked into his room. He was lying in the bed in a hospital gown and he looked old. Not just older, old. His face was gray and his hands were on the blanket, and he looked like a man who had spent his entire life being large and loud and certain and who was now lying in a bed that made him small. My mother was there. Tyler was there. Tyler's wife Stacy was in the hallway with their kids. And when I walked in, my father looked at me and his eyes did something that I had never seen them do before. They filled with tears. He said, Rosie, you came. I said, of course I came. And I meant it. Because I had decided that I would not allow his failure to become my template. I would not repeat the math he had done 20 years ago. I would not weigh the cost of showing up against the inconvenience of being present and decide that someone else's crisis was more important. I sat in that hospital for 7 hours while my father had bypass surgery. I sat in the waiting room with my mother and Tyler. I drank terrible coffee from a machine in the hallway. I answered work emails on my phone because MedBridge didn't stop existing because I was in Pennsylvania, and I handled both things because that is what adults do. They hold multiple truths at the same time, and they don't let one cancel the other. And when my father came out of surgery and was moved to recovery, I was there. I was sitting in the chair beside his bed when he opened his eyes. The chair was not empty. I was in it. He looked at me. He looked at the chair. And I watched something cross his face that was the first honest expression I had seen on my father's face in my entire life. It was recognition, not of me, of what I was doing, of what it meant to be sitting in a chair beside someone's hospital bed when they woke up from surgery, of what it meant that I was there and what it had meant 20 years ago that he was not. He didn't say it right away. He was groggy and weak, and the drugs were still wearing off, and he drifted in and out for the first few hours. My mother sat on the other side of the bed. Tyler stood near the window. We were all there, the whole family, present in a way that we had never been present for me. The irony was not lost on me, but I didn't let the irony make me bitter. I let it make me clear. On the second day of his recovery, when the drugs had worn off enough for him to think straight and the color had come back to his face and he could sit up slightly in the bed, my father looked at me and said, Rosie, can we talk? My mother and Tyler were in the cafeteria. It was just us. I said, yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, when I woke up from surgery and you were sitting there, I thought about you. I waited. He said, I thought about you waking up from your surgery when you were 14. My breath caught, not dramatically, just a small hitch in my chest, near the scar. He said, I wasn't there. I said, no, you weren't. He said, I was at Tyler's game. I said, I know. He was quiet again. His heart monitor beeped steadily beside him, the repaired heart doing its work. And I thought about how strange it was that we were both people with repaired hearts now, sitting in a hospital room, separated by 20 years and a lifetime of things unsaid. He said, "I have thought about that day more than you know." I said nothing. He said, "I have thought about it and I have tried to explain it to myself and I have tried to justify it and I can't. There is no justification. You were 14 and you were having heart surgery and I went to a football game. And you woke up alone." His voice broke on the word alone. I watched it break. I watched my father's voice crack on the word that had defined my childhood. And I felt something move in my chest that was complicated and painful and not entirely unwelcome. He said, "I am sorry, Rosie. I am more sorry than I know how to say. I was wrong. I was so wrong. And I know that sorry doesn't fix it. I know it doesn't undo waking up in that room with nobody there. But I need you to know that I know what I did and I know it was wrong and I have carried it every day since." I looked at my father. I looked at his gray face and his hospital gown and his hands on the blanket and the heart monitor beeping beside him and the IV in his arm. I said, "I need to tell you something." He nodded. I said, "That day changed me. Not just the surgery, the empty chair. It changed who I became. I built my entire adult life around the promise that I would never do to anyone what you did to me. My company exists because I woke up alone in a recovery room. Every system we build, every product we create, exists because I know what it feels like when no one shows up. And I need you to understand that your failure became my fuel, and I am grateful for what I built with it, but I am not grateful for the failure. The failure hurt me in ways that I am still understanding, and I need you to sit with that." He was crying. My father was crying in a hospital bed with a repaired heart and 20 years of unspoken truth between us. And I was not crying because I had cried enough about this in therapy and in James's arms and in the shower at 3 a.m, and I had earned the right to be clear-eyed in this moment. I said, "I also need you to know that I am here. I am sitting in this chair because I chose to be here, not because you earned it, not because you deserve it. Because I refuse to be the kind of person who leaves someone alone in a hospital room. That's not who I am. And you should know that who I am has nothing to do with you and everything to do with the girl who decided on a hospital bed at 14 years old that she would be different." He said, "You are different. You are so different from me, Rosie, and I am proud of you." I said, "Thank you." And I meant it. Not because I needed his pride. I had stopped needing that a long time ago, but because it was true, and truth, even late truth, has a weight that is worth acknowledging. We sat in that room for a while longer. The heart monitor beeped. The light through the window was the gray-white light of a Pennsylvania afternoon in winter. And something between us shifted, not dramatically, not with fireworks or a musical swell, but quietly, the way tectonic plates shift deep below the surface, imperceptibly but fundamentally. My father recovered. He went home. He followed his treatment plan with the specific diligence of a man who had recently confronted his own mortality and found it persuasive. He started cardiac rehabilitation. He walked every morning. He ate differently. He became, in some small but real way, a different person. Or maybe not a different person, but a person willing to look at who he had been and find it lacking. Over the following year, we rebuilt something. Not what we'd had before, because what we'd had before was not worth rebuilding. Something new. Something careful and honest and realistic. He called me every 2 weeks, not to talk about Tyler, not to talk about football, to talk about me, about my company, about Lily and Noah, about my life, the life I had built without him, the life he was now asking humbly to be allowed to witness. It was imperfect. It was sometimes awkward. There were conversations that stumbled into old patterns and had to be redirected. There were moments when he said something thoughtless, and I felt the old anger rise and had to choose, consciously, whether to address it or let it pass. But it was real, and real is not the same as perfect. Real is better. Tyler and I had a conversation, too, about a month after our father's surgery. He called me one evening and he said, "Rosie, I need to say something to you." I said, "Okay." He said, "I knew what Dad was doing when we were kids. I knew he was choosing me over you, and I let it happen because it felt good to be chosen. And I'm sorry. I should have said something. I should have told him to go to your surgery. I was 16 years old, and I was old enough to know that what was happening was wrong, and I said nothing because I didn't want to lose what I had. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Thank you for saying that, Tyler." He said, "I mean it." I said, "I know you do." And we talked for 45 minutes that night, the longest conversation we had ever had, and it was honest in a way that nothing between us had ever been honest before. And I hung up the phone feeling lighter than I had felt in years. My mother. I need to talk about my mother. About 6 months after my father's surgery, my mother came to visit me in Charlotte. She came alone, without my father, which was unusual. She stayed for 3 days. She played with Lily and Noah. She sat in my kitchen and drank coffee and looked around at my house and my life and my family. And she said very quietly on the second evening after the children were in bed, "I should have been there, Rosie." I knew what she meant. I didn't need to ask. She said, "I should have been there when you woke up. I should not have left. Tyler's situation at the school was not an emergency. It was an inconvenience. And I left my daughter in post-operative recovery for an inconvenience. And I have lived with that every single day since." I said, "I know." She said, "I spent my whole marriage letting your father's priorities become my priorities. I let his obsession with Tyler become the center of everything. And you paid for that. You paid for it with your childhood, and you paid for it with that empty chair, and I cannot undo it, and I am so deeply, deeply sorry." I looked at my mother. I saw her clearly, maybe for the first time. I saw a woman who had been exhausted by her own compliance, who had spent decades managing a family system that was fundamentally unfair, and who had lacked the courage or the energy or the support to challenge it. I saw a woman who had loved me in every way that didn't require bravery, and who had failed me in the one moment that did. And I saw a woman who was sitting in my kitchen at 62 years old, finally saying the words that had been locked inside her for 20 years. I said, "Mom, I forgive you." And I meant it. Not easily, not cheaply. Forgiveness that comes easily has no weight. This forgiveness was heavy. It had been forged over years of therapy and self-examination and the slow, difficult work of separating what happened to me from who I became. It was real forgiveness, the kind that doesn't erase the past, but refuses to let the past own the future. She cried. I cried. We sat in my kitchen and we cried together, and James heard us from the other room, and he came in and he saw what was happening, and he quietly put a box of tissues on the table and left again, because he is the kind of man who knows when to be present and when to give space. And I love him for that, among 10,000 other things. If stories like this resonate with you, don't forget to subscribe. There are more stories on this channel, stories about real people and real families and real pain and real redemption, and I think you'll find something in them that speaks to whatever you're carrying right now. I want to tell you one more thing before I end this story. Last year, MedBridge Solutions was featured in a national healthcare publication for our family communication systems. The article included an interview with me, and the reporter asked me why I started the company. I told her the truth. I told her about the surgery and the empty chair and the nurse named Denise. The article was published online, and my father read it. He called me that evening, and his voice was thick, and he said, "I read the article, Rosie." I said, "I know." He said, "You turned the worst thing I ever did into something that helps people." I said, "Yes." He said, "I don't deserve that." I said, "It wasn't for you, Dad. It was never for you. It was for the next 14-year-old girl who wakes up from surgery. It was so she doesn't wake up alone." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I love you, Rosie." And I said, "I love you too, Dad." And I meant it. Both things. The love and the two. Because the truth of my life is that I love my father and my father failed me, and both of those things are true at the same time, and I have stopped trying to make one of them cancel the other. I am 34 years old. I have a scar on my chest and a company that I built and a family that I chose and 2 children who will never, Not once, not ever, wake up in a room and find the chair empty. I have a father who is learning, late, how to be present. I have a mother who is learning, late, how to be brave. I have a brother who is learning, late, how to see me. And I have myself. The girl who woke up alone and decided that alone was not the end of the story. It was the beginning. That chair beside my hospital bed was empty 20 years ago, but I filled it. I filled it with everything I built and everyone I love and every single moment I chose to show up when it would have been easier not to. And if you are someone who has ever woken up and found the chair empty, if you are someone who has ever looked around a room and realized that the people who should have been there chose to be somewhere else, I want you to hear me. You are not what they chose. You are not their absence. You are not the empty chair. You are what comes after. You are the person who gets up and builds something so bright and so real and so full of love that the emptiness of that moment becomes nothing more than a shadow behind you, shrinking every day, every single day as you walk further and further into the life you built for yourself. My name is Rosie Brennan. I woke up alone, and I am not alone anymore. This is my story, and I am so glad I stayed to tell it.